Chapter 3 High Council of Farandal Heights. Jenias had opened his bakery shop early in the morning. It seemed that today was quite busy. He had forgotten to deliver Vigris's rye bread. No matter. The bakery stood just across the street, and Vigris had known him too well to surmise it on ill, conscious decision. The baker was a hard-working man, having moved from his hometown near Elysia when the Apogean War had concluded. The lavish life might appeal to many immortals, but he had determined to spend an eternity being of use to others. It was perhaps also the reason he never expanded his shop. His strict integrity had shut him out of mundane successes, and opened the nature as sweet as flowers to bees, and as sweetly as he gave them the honey which honour and morals had distilled no sour drop. Vigris had suspected that his adherence to the ideals might have also affected how he dressed himself. Jenias wore only plain clothes, not the kind which spawned out of poverty, but an extension of his inner avowal to appear presentable, not opulent as to attract envious eyes, nor scruffy as to induce discomfort. Despite those attributes of his, Jenias never resented Vigris for wearing rather costly apparel, for he understood the high society's demand. It was also perhaps due to the fact that Vigris wore whatever was fit for the occasion. He might wear his humble gravekeeper suit, his equerry outfit, or the latest fashion from Votten. This morning, when Vigris arrived at the bakery, he was wearing the formal costume for the High Council meeting. His unloaded flintlock, bearing the crest of equerry, was strapped at his belt, as was the tradition practiced by the nobility and the military on state events.
"Oh, by a beauty!"
exclaimed Jenias as he saw Vigris at the bakery's door.
"How did I forget my dear neighbour's bread?"
Akala's head turned.
"Ah, Vigia."
She quickly noticed how he dressed.
"Is there a meeting at the palace?"
Vigris conquered his surprise at finding her here, just quick enough to hide it entirely. He noticed her swollen eyes, but pretended as if he didn't. She had clearly been crying last night. So much has happened in a short period of time. Of course there is a meeting. Jenias, will you feed the cats on my doorstep? He asked the baker as he picked up a lump sum of bread from the counter.
"I will,"
said the baker, as he wrapped Akala's orders in a cloth and placed them neatly in a wicker basket. His face fell quickly as he wiped his hands and turned to his dear neighbour.
"Poor Elaine. If I know her, she must have been thinking of those cats."
"She has a good heart," added Akala, having no temerity to use the past tense.
"I didn't know she still feeds them. On a daily basis, too," added Jenias.
The door to the bakery swung open.
"Vigia, there you are. I knocked on the door when—" "Oh."
It was Neria. She broke her steps upon seeing Vigris's former wife.
"Lady Akala."
"You must be Neria of House Hesena," said Akala, smiling as best she could despite her swollen eyes. Her hollowed cheeks certainly did not help her hide any semblance of melancholy, although she looked the epitome of good taste, elegance, and poise still.
"I am, and very honoured to find you here. I visited your family's estate in Durial a few weeks ago. Your family has the best winery in all of Treston." "Thank you. My family has the utmost respect for the Navriers, as we all do. Even my name. My father gave me my very name as a way to honour House Navrier. I met your father once, years ago. A good man. There's a reason Our Lady reserves a soft spot for your family." "I've heard so," replied Akala. "But the Esfil are on the rise now. I believe Our Lady wants us to have better defense and less festivities, which is understandable in such times. And House Esfil's smithies are among the best. Do you know? Perhaps the best we have." "I am well aware of it, milady. Nothing remains the same. That's what my father had taught me. Like a wheel. What we can do in the meanwhile is keep going, for the wheel will eventually spin."
"He taught you well." She paused, then changing the topic.
"I did not know it is customary in Duriel to have breakfast."
She narrowed her eyes.
"I thought you only had a drought."
"We do only have a drought, but I like to think of myself as native to Farandel Heights."
Vigris cleared his throat. "I believe we are running late, Neria, for the High Council meeting."
"Not quite, but nearly,"
replied Neria.
"Well," she took a deep breath, "it is a delight to finally see you in person, milady."
Akala curled a smile.
"The feeling's mutual."
They could see the cats before Vigris's doorstep once they were outside. There were at least 5 of them, sitting patiently for Elaine to come out the door.
"Poor creatures,"
commented Neria.
"I cannot even begin to imagine what my birds would do should I disappear."
"I asked Jenius to feed the cats. They'll be all right." They made their way up the slanted city, towards the bridge that connected Farandel Heights to the Farandel Palace.
"We are quite different, aren't we, Akala and I?"
said Neria.
"I imagined we would be quite similar in appearance."
Vigris turned to face the female elf walking beside him. Her face looked even paler under the cloudy morning, but her pink lips were ardent. "You thought I like you because you fit my fancy?"
"Don't I?"
She bit her lip, smiling playfully. "Don't pamper yourself, girl."
"I don't. I am speaking the truth, and you know it."
They reached the Grand Bridge, straddling over a deep ravine. Isolde's divine seat stood in the palace at the other end of the bridge, built over 3,000 years ago, almost a millennia before Isolde's and Iris's arrival in Gotterhavn. Farandel Palace stood on a level ground, which seemed as though carved into the slope of the mountain, like a glittering gem, half swallowed by grey rocks. Some rooms were built into the steep incline, some pointed roofs poking out of the rocky surface, dull blue in colour. The palace was a cluster of towers, with bridges connecting them, Hypogean hallways, high windows, and flying buttresses supporting the tall structures. The walls were of limestone, whose age had given them the flair that new stones were unable to match. And this flare, like the moon, was a salient view from anywhere in the valley. Vigris reckoned it had been built mainly as a defensive structure, and it had shown its efficacy through the ages. Castle and fortresses fell, but not Farandel Heights. At the conclusion of the Epogean War, Gotterhavn had changed. The victor's crypt's descent could be predicted by the oracles, but where it would land, no one could tell. Battles were then fought near its landing site, or at borders where pilgrims met and territorial conflicts were common. So castles were no longer points of contention. Farandel Heights, like many other castles, became a palace whose main entrance was raised taller than the walls. It was beautiful. But beauty, to Vigris, was a strange thing. It escaped his notice most of the time. Only when he took his time did it occur to him what new eyes actually saw upon seeing it for the first time. And the more he took his time, the more the palace seemed to reveal its secrets. For then, he began to notice traces of rains, of summer heat, and he began to wonder how it was built. Its architects were not known by name. Names were reserved for rulers. Its draughtsmen and carpenters and masons who stacked one block of stone at a time, he could only imagine. Perhaps one of the elders had lived when the scaffolding was still in place, when the rooms were exposed to the elements, and noises of pounding hammers and chisels and roarings of saws reverberated on these cliffs.
"How's Rivnai?"
asked Neria when the couple stopped at the Grand Bridge, as was customary for the couple. They would visit the bridge in the morning to eat their breakfast whenever they could. He seated himself on a bench and took out his cloth-wrapped bread. "She takes too much liberty in her sorrow, I'm afraid."
"I fear for her."
"So do I," replied Vigris. "It seems that her belief on Elaine's return is fading every minute. I now have to worry about 2 people. He then finished his breakfast in silence. His bites were small and thoughtful. Not once did he turn to face the girl beside him. His eyes were fixed on the grey faces of the slope and the aqueducts that straddled over the ravine from the precipice to the city. It was also in silence how they made their way towards the gatehouse of the palace at the opposite end of the bridge. Beyond the gate, the courtyard was bustling with people. There were guards, servitors, scullions, worshippers from far regions of Treston, statesmen, council members. Some were familiar to him, some unknown.
"Gain his trust," said Neria. "Remember, we aren't questioning him. We are trying to learn what he wants. Why he's here. Has he demanded blood since his arrival?"
"No, he has shown nothing but compliance. I don't know what to make of him."
"Does he eat?"
"Not that I know of."
"I need to see him for myself before the High Council meeting. I don't want to speak in speculation before the assembly."
The Great Tower had been transformed multiple times in history. It had been the main keep where Oravain used to meditate. It had been a granary during Isolde's early reign. It had been used to house the elders. It had been a library before the collection of books became too abundant. Now, it was a barrack and a watchtower, and its underground rooms became the dungeon. Neria and Vigris stood before its entrance, where it had a clear view of Isolde's basilica. The couple greeted the guards and entered. Inside was rather warm. There was a whiff of mulled ale in the air. The guards were provided with it alongside a chunk of bread for breakfast. The smell disappeared once they took the stairs down to the dungeon. The air was damp, and there was no light, save that from the torches. 2 men had been stationed here. They had been sitting down and chatting when Vigris and Neria approached.
"We're here to see Noska,"
began Neria.
"Aye, milady."
One of the men led them to a door and opened it with a rusty key. As the door swayed open, a scrawny man could be seen sitting in a corner. He was pale and weak, his clothes tattered. His hair was silver-shot, although he did not seem too old, and was sparse and ungroomed. "Good morning, Noska," said Vigris, who couldn't help but feel sympathy for the vampire.
"Ah, sir, I would have kissed your hands were I not so pathetic."
Noska's accent was vague. He was sweaty, cold sweat, it seemed to Vigris, and he could not stop trembling. The equerry turned to Neria. There was compassion in her eyes, and in her slightly gaping lips a word that failed to sound.
"Milady,"
said Noska.
"Muivin, I hope my appearance does not offend you."
Neria gave him a faint smile before turning back and walking out of the room. "Have you eaten anything?" asked Vigris.
"Oh, sir,
Vampires do not eat ordinary food. I've tried long ago. Never getting accustomed to it. Always puked it. Sometimes I retch thinking about it.
Vigia, called Neria. I don't want to be late for the meeting.
Vigris nodded at the vampire. I hope we'll be able to do something about your situation. With that, he strolled out. I thought you wanted to learn about him, he whispered to Neria as they made their way out of the dungeon.
I did, she replied. I've learned enough.
He understood. Neria always wanted to be spared of sad stories. The High Council meeting took place in the council chamber, a semicircular room inside the main palace. The name Farandul Palace was often used to describe all the buildings inside the walls, from the great tower near the gatehouse, Isolde's Basilica standing on the opposite part of the courtyard across the great tower. The main palace with its many towers, half built into the face of the cliff, and the grand quarters, which accommodated a variety of people, from the cooks to the courtiers. It was busy on regular days, and with people coming from all across Treston to attend the High Council meeting, it was even busier. There were carriages and soldiers in different colours. The palace entrance that sat on top of a tall set of steps saw many people hurrying in and out. The central vestibule had a tall ceiling, and yet this morning it felt to him as though the air was rather condensed. The council chamber was especially busy. It had always been so on the days of meetings. Conceited noblemen, all-knowing statesmen, importunate guildsmen, and the people he failed to judge, all gathered here to talk about the populace. Isolde herself had never attended the council in all the years Vigris had been granted a seat in the assembly. This was a place for discussions, and her mandate was not. I'll find you after the meeting, he told Neria. She nodded and walked to her seat among the nobles. There were 4 rows of seats in the chamber, one for the noble families, one for the guilds, one for the ecclesiastics, known as the mysteries, and one for the military. As an equerry, he sat among the last. At the front of the seats, facing the whole chamber, were the seats of the elders. There was a low hum in the room, but all sound ceased to silence once Lisvinia entered the room. Her mere presence lent the place a grave aspect. Such was the effect the most respected apostle commanded from the assembly. She walked without a smile, narrow as a blade, unfaltering as an arrow. Her words were true. She never spoke to suit the pleasure or convenience of others. This he realized just now, as well as the unfounded doubt cast upon her on the day Elaine was killed. Once she settled down at the head of the elders' seats, the council meeting commenced. The discussions began with the least concerning subjects, though it did not take long before they began to discuss more pressing matters. The dukes of the southern provinces spoke of the situation at the southern borders. The arms received by the garrisons were apparently insufficient, one Lady Ramil jested, and said that the difference between ploughing and defending against skirmishes was that the farming tools were smeared in mud in the former and blood in the latter. From the port cities came the tidings of frequent attempts to commandeer merchant ships crossing the Sonomia and Baoric Gulfs. It was difficult to determine whether they were organized fleet of Novakra, pirates, or mercenaries. Neria was the one to bring Noska's situation to the assembly. Vigris had asked her specifically, since she was a trusted member of the aristocrats, a reliable and well-connected individual. He heard gasps and saw heads turning once she mentioned the vampire. She left no detail unspoken upon explaining how the vampire had arrived in the very heart of Treston, as Vigris had expected of her, knowing how meticulous she was. After her introduction, Vigris was then presented by her as a first-hand account in the case. He rose to his feet and confirmed what Neria had said. He then proceeded to speak of the chronological description of the night Noska was found. A small case this might be, but no other discussion piqued a genuine interest as it did. The next discussion was of Elaine's murder. Vigris discovered that there had also been several murders taking place in the provinces. Duke Frevis rose from his seat when he spoke. He was so elaborate in his story that he seemed to have been carried away. He made his way to the aisle as he recounted the assassination of his heir, and began to walk down towards the bottom of the chamber, where the elders were seated, so that everyone present could see him better.
All these suffering and death and resurrection, I don't quite grasp how they could exist in the land of immortals. Are we, then, immortals?
We are, sir, unless we choose otherwise, replied Vasioris.
The Duke inched closer to the elders and addressed them. He said,
I remember what Her Holiness has taught us all of the dream analogy. We exist in phantasm, as if in a dream. Is it not so? There are higher planes of existence, such as the High Fount's own heaven. Correct me if I stray from her teachings, but arriving in heaven feels as if our existence in Gotterhavn was merely a nightmare. That's what lures people towards the Victor's Crypt. If that is so, then why do we shun death and destruction? After all, we could always return.
He then pulled out his ornate pistol and shot Lysvinia in the face. Everyone jumped to their feet as the Duke reloaded his firearm. No one was composed enough to realize what he was going to do next. Before anyone could reach him, Duke Frevis shot himself in the temple.